Hi everyone. This is the third lecture, which is the constructor and its types. This is the YouTube video you can watch, and this is the article, and this is the website. So let's start. So, what are constructors? Basically, we also read briefly about constructors in the first article. So, constructors are basically special methods in the object oriented programming which are used to initialize the objects of a class. This is the basic understanding I guess all of us might have. So they play a pivotal role in ensuring that an object is in a valid state right after it is created. Unlike regular methods, constructor have some features. So let's talk about key features of constructors. Constructors basically are called automatically whenever an object of a class is instantiated. So this is the automatic invocation feature. So whenever I'm going to define a class and in the main class, I'm going to define the object of the class. So whenever any object of the class is instantiated, a constructor is automatically called. So the first feature is the automatic invocation. The second feature is also very important, which is no return time. So unlike like other methods which have particular return types, normal functions and methods of classes, constructors do not have any return type, not even void. Okay, very important to remember. Also, constructors provide us with an overloading support. We can have multiple constructors with different parameters in the same class, enabling flexibility in object initialization. For example, we can have a default constructors with no parameters. We can have a parameterized constructor with different number of parameters. Now we can have multiple variations within the parameterized constructor also. We can have parameters, we can have different number of parameters, different data types of parameters, etc. and etc. So we have an overloading support as well. So these are the key features. Now what are the different types of constructors? First and very basic is default constructor. So even if you do not write a constructor in the code of your class, it is automatically, implicitly, basically present over there. So default constructor is basically a no argument constructor. So when no constructor is defined, if you do not explicitly create any constructor for a class, so Java automatically provides a default constructor. So this constructor initializes the instance variables to their default values based on the data type. Yeah, for example, if we haven't initialized or wrote the constructor, explicitly defined it, now there might be some variables in our class. So now how will Java decide what default values to give to those variables? Because in default constructor, since we won't have any parameters, so we won't have any default values also. So there are some standard default values that are assigned. For int it is 0, for double it is 0.0, for boolean it is false, and for all the objects it is null. So as you can see in this code also, we have a class movie, and these are the two attributes of the class. So we do not have a constructor over in this class, we only have a function. Now if I am going to call this function, now what title should be printed? We have already learned that for object it is going to be null, so string is a kind of an object. So for display details it will print title null, and duration is it int, so it will be 0 minutes. Okay, yeah, so this is the output, right? So explicitly defining a default constructor with custom values. You can define your default constructor to set custom default values for the class fields instead of relying on Java's implicit default values. Yes, this can also be done. So if we have a class movie, so this refers to the current object. So this dot title equals to untitled, and this dot duration equals to 90. So these are some random values that we have assigned. So if we will now call the display details function, so title will be printed as untitled and duration will be printed as 90 minutes, because we have now wrote a custom default constructor. So the default values that the Java implicitly gives won't be used, rather than these values which we have specifically wrote would be used, right? So yeah, this was the output, and we can also see the diagram in the main class. We have created the instance of the movie class, right? So by explicitly defining a default constructor, we basically gain control over how objects are initialized, ensuring that they can start with meaningful default values that match the application's requirements. Next is parameterized constructor. So parameterized constructor basically takes argument to initialize the objects with some specific values. For example, we have a class movie. Class movie has two attributes. Now parameterized constructor will take these attributes value in the main class. As we can see, we are going to pass some values, and these values will be passed on to our object. As in the previous articles in examples we have already seen, this is the methodology that we were using. We were passing on values to our objects in the main class itself while we were creating an object. So this way is known as parameterized constructor. So we are going to create an instance of movie class in the main class. So what will be our output? Title would be Inception and duration would be 148 minutes. The same values which we passed from here. Next is copy constructor. So what is a copy constructor? A copy constructor initializes an object using another object of the same class. Yeah. So for example, a car class had two different objects. So a car2 object will get the properties of the car1 object. Is you can think of it like that. Okay. So suppose we have a class movie over here, and we have this parameterized constructor, and this we have a copy constructor. Here we are going to pass the object, direct object. So we are passing the movie object over here. So we are going to extract the other objects attributes and copy those attributes value in our object, right? So we have an original object created. Now in our copy object we are going to pass the original, and then we are going to assign the values from the original to our copied object, right? So this is the copy constructor in which we pass the object of the same class. So if we call the display details for both the original and the copy, we are going to get the same output because both of them have the same values. Same diagram over here. Now, what is a private constructor? A private constructor is used to restrict object creation from outside the class. It is commonly used in singleton design pattern. So, design patterns we are going to learn further as we progress through this course. So, for example, till now in all the examples that we saw that the constructors are basically public. But in private constructors, what happens is we declare the constructors as private. So, in private constructor we are not since the constructor is private, we are not allowed to create the object of the class, right? We can only create the object of the class through a method. This is basically to prevent some mishaps or something. We can see this example over here. We have a singleton S1. So we call singleton.getInstance method. So basically we can only create one object, and that will only be created once. For example, in the first call, what would happen? Let's decode and run check the flow. We created singleton.getInstance. Okay, so we will come here on the 5th line. So this is the getInstance method is called. It will check instance is null. Yeah, instance is null because we haven't created any instance yet. This is a static variable. So instance is equal to new singleton. Now an instance is created over here, and we are going to return that instance. So S1 will now have the instance. Now we are going to create S2. Now it will call the get instance. Now it will check, is instance null? No. So the previous instance will only be returned since it is a static variable. So both will have the same value, right? So S1 will be equals to S2. Yes, because both reference to the same instance, as this is a static variable and both different objects won't have different value of the attributes. So this is basically this is the way to basically restrict the object creation from outside the class. As you can see, through this method only we can create the object, and that too only once it can be created. So even if we try to write it multiple times, we will always be returned with the first instance of the class only. Okay. So key points to remember, let's go through them also. A class can have multiple constructors through overloading, but they must differ in parameter list. Very important. We cannot define the same constructor twice. We can have multiple constructors, but they should be different in the parameters overloading. Constructors can call another constructors in the same class using this keyword. Yes, definitely we can call, since constructor 2 can call constructor 1 using this keyword. Constructor can call parent class constructors using super keyword in Java. In Java, we can use a super keyword like if we have an inherited class. For example, in an inherited class, we have a constructor and the inherited class object accepts an attribute that is present in the parent class. So using super keyword, we can also call the constructor of the parent class to set the value of the attribute in the parent class. Okay. Always use constructors to ensure that the objects are in a consistent and valid state. This was the main purpose of the constructor, right? We always want that the object should be consistent and in a valid state. We should utilize copy constructors to avoid shallow copying when deep copying is required. Yeah, so copy constructor should be used carefully, because what happens is in copy constructors basically do shallow copy because they just copy the values from another object. If deep copy is required, then we have to reference our variable to the both objects should reference to the same point in the memory, right? So both of the new objects should reference to the same place. So that is the deep copy. So leveraging private constructors for singleton pattern or utility classes. So let's talk about the interview questions. So the first question that we have is, can a constructor be final, static, or abstract? So let's think about it. Final. What does final essentially mean? So final keyword is used when we have to declare something, not that we cannot inherit something or we cannot override that function. So if we are declaring a function to be final, so that function cannot be inherited by any other class and that cannot be overridden. So how can constructors be final, right? So it is like meaningless, because if you are declaring a constructor to be final, because it is irrelevant, because a constructor cannot be inherited anyways, and final also is telling us the same thing. So now talking about static. Static is basically, static keywords tells us that a particular thing belongs to the class. But what are constructors? Constructors are basically used to initialize the objects, right? So constructors are basically tied to the object creation. So since constructors are tied to object creation, they cannot be static. Next, talking about the object. So abstract. We know that abstract classes are those classes in which the child class basically implement the abstract class, because abstract class do not have complete implementation. So if we are going to declare a constructor abstract, that would kind of mean that the constructor is not completely implemented yet. And if a constructor is not completely implemented, how are we going to use that constructor to create an object, right? So constructor must have complete definition. So a constructor must be concrete as it initializes an object. So these are the 3 points. So next is, what happens if you explicitly define a constructor with arguments but no default constructor? Okay, so if in a class, for example, this is a class, we only have this constructor and we do not define the default constructor. So if we are trying to call the default constructor, even though we have not defined the default constructor and we have defined another parameterized constructor, so that will give us the compilation error, because it will only refer to this constructor now. If your class was not having any constructor defined, only in that case Java will provide us with an implicit constructor. So default constructor is not automatically provided. Attempting to create an object with no arguments would result in a compilation error. Next question. What happens if you create an object of a subclass? Which constructor is called first? For example, we have a parent class and then we have a child class. So the constructor of the parent class is called first and then the child class is called first, because that is how a child is created, right? A child is created with the from the parent. So first parent comes and then child comes. So similarly with this analogy, first the constructor of the parent is called and then the constructor of the child class is called. So this basically ensures the proper initialization. So what happens if a constructor is synchronized? So not to go in this very detail, synchronized basically means it is used in some thread safety. So synchronized is basically only one thread will work at a particular time, so we are basically locking that. But what happens is constructor, if we make the constructor synchronized, so object creation will happen during that time, right? So synchronization won't be applicable because object is not fully created and we are locking that object kind of. So that is like kind of makes no sense. So can a constructor be inherited? No, as we discussed in the final keyword, same concept. Constructors cannot be inherited. They can be called, as we learned about super keyword, right? That the parent class constructor can be called from the child class constructor using the super keyword. But inheriting a constructor and calling a constructor of parent class using super keyword are two different things, okay? So this answer would be no. Sixth is, can a constructor have a return statement? Yeah, so constructor can simply write return, and but they cannot have a return value to that. For exiting a program or like exiting early, we can write the return statement, but we cannot return a value. For example, this is a class. This is a public example, and we can see we are just returning over here. So suppose we have a value 10 passed over here. So what will be going? Value is less than 0? No. So the value will be assigned as 10, correct? Next is minus 5. Yeah. So value would be less than 0, correct? So it will print this and it will return. Okay, so what will the value be printed? The value will be printed as the default value. We know, right? The default value will be, since the default value of integer is 0, so here it will be printed value 0 in the case of minus 5. Okay. Yeah, so these are all the questions. We have also completed this article. Thank you.